There we are. Good evening. Hope everybody's well. Got a lot to cover as always tonight. We're going to go to Israel. We're going to go to Cyprus and thereabouts. And we are also going to Iraq and Iran, Baghdad, and the U.S. Embassy. So we've got a lot to cover. Alrighty. So thank you. Got everybody here. George says you can hear me now. That works out just great. Just needed to post an image the last moment there just because we had a request, and we're good. All right. Okay. So want to just go down through the list in the chat room. Welcome, Carol, who came in very early this evening. Great to see you. George, as always. George is holding fort. We're going to talk about the attack against the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, what that means, and that's why we're focusing on the Middle East this evening, is because of that attack on Tuesday. Pamela's heading back to work. That's great to hear. Back in good health. And Rise and Shine had asked if we could talk about the Silk Road in Israel, China's Silk Road, and that's why I was a little delayed getting started, because I wanted to put that map up very quickly so we could refer to that, and we will certainly do that early on in the live stream this evening. Susan's here. Great to see you. And Dr. Darnell, as always, is in this evening. Thank you, and thank you for your emails, Doctor. And let's see who else we have. We've got a lot of people in the background, as always, but that's great. Eileen is here. Always good to see you as a regular. And Sherry's back with us. Excellent. Thank you. Good to see you. Prosperity Now is here. Excellent. We see you every once in a while popping in here, so that's very welcome. Jonathan Steele is back. Outstanding. Check your social credit scores. Okay, sir, we'll do that. And Carolyn's here. Excellent. So let's go ahead, and I'm flying solo tonight. As I said, my wife and I had a lot going on today, and she's still kind of tidying and tying things up and getting things back together for us. So pretty much I'll be on my own unless she happens to have a little time to pop in. It's cold here tonight, putting on my thermals here in New Hampshire. Let's see what she's saying here. Okay, everything's, you're going to hear my phone dinging because it's text messages coming in from my wife. But at any rate, let's get right to scripture here this evening, and a little more of a serious discussion as opposed to last night's discussions where we had our friend the chimpanzee throwing darts. Ezekiel 38:2, very familiar to everyone. Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. Prophesy against him. And I've got the image of the island of Cyprus up here, and there are rumblings and rattlings and saber rattling going on around in Cyprus. But I have mentioned to you as patrons many times that the Russians have a naval presence, a naval base in the southern end of Cyprus, and we're going to go through a little bit of what is going on that island related to not specifically the Russians, but indirectly the Russians, by way of Turkey, which controls the northern portion of about 49% of the island of Cyprus, and the 51% to the south by the Cypriots themselves, the Greek Cypriots. But this is going to bring in Turkey, and therefore, because it's going to bring Turkey into the mix, it is going to bring Russia into the mix. And the mix that I am referring to on this little island, and I will put this up here for you to take a look at it. It's a little blurry, this image. Let me just bring it down and maybe it'll be a little sharper. But anyway, give you an idea of what's going on, and take a look at the demilitarized zone, as I call it, the buffer zone maintained by the UN that divides this poor little island. So why am I talking about Cyprus? Well, this is going to really begin to pull together Israel and Cyprus and therefore Turkey and Russia and the Greek government. All these guys are getting together, okay? Let me see if I have this article here. There it is. If you'll refer to the article that I sent to you before the live stream, where I announced we would have a live stream this evening, you no doubt know where I'm going with this. This is from Breaking Israel News today, January 2nd, 2020. Israel, Cyprus, and Greece are signing an agreement to build a pipeline that will bring Israeli gas across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. All right, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Energy Minister Yuval Steinitz traveled to Athens, Greece on Thursday, where they are to sign a three-way gas agreement with Cyprus and Greece that sets the stage for the exploration of exportation of natural gas to Europe. Again, this is dated today. Under the prospective agreement, Israel and Cyprus will jointly export gas from their offshore wells through Greece and Italy to the rest of Europe. Though Italy will not attend the summit, it is expected to sign the agreement in the near future. Before leaving for Athens, Netanyahu announced, "We are headed to a very important summit with the president of Cyprus and the newly elected Greek prime minister." Now, before I go on much further with this, I'm going to come back on camera. Again, to put this in context and give you a little retrospective reference, in my second novel, published in 2014, 2048, Diamonds in the Rough, much of the storyline and the action that takes place with the Navy SEALs there is in Cyprus. And there's a Mount Olympus on Cyprus, by the way, right there in the dividing line where the UN maintains the peace, so to speak, with our peacekeeping forces. But there's a British naval base down on the coast, of course, and a naval radar station on the top of Mount Olympus. And it is at that radar station that I focus much of the attention in the novel into the storyline. But I've said in the past that I chose Cyprus because I was imagining myself as a general or as an admiral and trying to determine a strategic location in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, from which to control the Mediterranean. Cyprus historically has fulfilled that role, and I've been leading you on over the last couple of years saying, watch Cyprus, watch for Cyprus to come up in the news. So, today, Cyprus popped up on the radar, so to speak, the British radar scope. If any of you have read my book, 2048 Diamonds in the Rough, you'll understand what I'm talking about as far as the radar installation up there and what takes place, and it involves a quantum computer, of course. So, on the radar today, we now have Greece, the Cypriots, and Israel joining forces to transport natural gas, because remember, I have said to you that Israel has, between Cyprus and the coast of Israel, and that also involves the coast of Syria, bear that in mind, Israel has the largest natural gas and oil deposit, but specifically natural gas deposit in the world at this time, under the seabed of the Mediterranean between Cyprus and Israel. It's called the Leviathan natural gas field. I've been warning that there is going to be a conflict centered upon Cyprus. This could be the match. It's certainly the hook in the jaw for Russia. Russia cannot resist the natural gas in the Leviathan. What a great name. Leviathan natural gas field. And we know that Russia has been trying to gain control over Syria now doing this in partnership with Turkey. We've covered this for a couple of months now, where Turkey and Russia, by way on the surface, the purchase by Turkey, a UN member, a NATO member, NATO set up to be in defense of Europe against Russia, the former USSR, but a NATO member still to this day, Turkey purchasing from Russia the S-400 missile system. Okay, and then we talked about the 50 nuclear devices that the U.S. has in its air base in northern Turkey. Russia wants to control Syria by way of Turkey and the Russian troops have been moving steadily south through Syria, and we have an outpost, if you will, of U.S. troops that are guarding natural gas and oil, crude oil pumping station east of Damascus. Essentially, they're being surrounded, our U.S. troops in Syria. But the bigger point is that Russia wants to build a natural gas pipeline through Syria in order to export natural gas into Europe, because Russia desperately needs the revenue from the sale of natural gas to the European nations. The Russian economy is not healthy. This is the hook in the jaw for Russia. Natural gas and oil. Now, in addition to the Leviathan natural gas field, which also has oil deposits in it, are the oil deposits in the Golan Heights between Syria and Israel proper. And as I've said to you before, about 18 months ago, it was announced by Israel that they have determined the wellspring of crude oil, if you will, the wellspring, the source of all crude oil in the Middle East, is in the Golan, in the controlled area of the Golan controlled by Israel. Russia wants that. Also, earlier in 2019, Israel announced that there was a gold discovery in excess of $1 billion with a B, billion-dollar gold discovery in the Golan. Hook in the jaw. Now, let's go back to Cyprus itself. I want to go to this map. And you'll see down here in the southern area, we have British, UK controlled area down at the very end. But over here in Paphos, we have Russia. Let's take a look at that again. This map here is a little bit dated, but it says it is expected Russian planes will be allowed to use the military air base at Paphos. Now, the Russians also have a deal that allows them to use the ports at Lumsal and Larnaca. So, air capacity, naval capacity in the Greek Cypriot administered area of southern Cyprus. The Russians are already on Cyprus. Let's go back to this article. The Prime Minister, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister added that we have established an alliance in the Middle East of tremendous importance for the future of Israel's energy and turning it into an energy superpower. The Athens summit occurs in the context of recent strategic talks between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, and the launch of Israel's offshore Leviathan gas field on Tuesday. Of course, this has been around for over 2 years now, the discussion of the Leviathan gas field. It's not a recent discovery, but that was discussed on Tuesday. The largest energy project in Israel's history. It is expected to yield 22 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, paving the way for multi-billion-dollar gas export deals with Egypt and Jordan. Okay? Look at the tentacles that are going on here. Look at what is being spread out. think I have another, let me check let's see what we have here. Yeah. Okay, so again, just to reinforce, the Russians who want control of Israel's Leviathan gas field and want to export through Syria from the Leviathan gas field, which is off to the right of this image here. Okay, that's between Cyprus and Israel in the Mediterranean. They already have an air force and a naval presence on the island of Cyprus. They incidentally are not mentioned in this agreement. They are left out of this agreement. That's why it threw a red flag on the field for me. Russia is not part of this agreement between Greece, the Cypriots, and Israel. Very telling. This is why I'm saying this possibly could be a match. It's going to set things off for Gog and Magog. Because the Turks are up here in the north, and I'll give you a little historical review as to how that occurred in just a moment. But you have what ostensibly now is a Russian ally in the north by way of the Turks, and the Russians themselves in the south. This is like a vice being squeezed on the island of Cyprus. And right in the middle are the UN troops, you can see in blue here, that are trying to maintain a demilitarized zone. Because there has been military conflict in the recent past between the North and the South. Do you think the Russians with their air force and their naval base, 2 of them, do you really think they're going to let themselves be locked out of this deal? The Russian economy is crumbling. The stage is set. Cyprus strategically, physically, is located in a perfect position to control the Mediterranean. And it has so throughout history been a strategic launching point for naval operations by many nations, certainly the Greeks. Turkey has always claimed the island of Cyprus in its entirety as its own. Early in the 20th century, there were military actions going on that I'll review with you in a minute. But we are going to see on Cyprus a conflict when the Russians decide to do more than saber rattling. When they decide that they are going to take control of the island of Cyprus as a military base in its entirety. That sounds absurd, but that's a very small island. Why do the Russians want to control Cyprus? Because from there they can control the export of natural gas from the Leviathan natural gas field in the Mediterranean, heading from Cyprus to Europe. And concurrently, the pipeline that they are trying to build from Israel through Syria, through Turkey, into the rest of the European continent. 2 pipelines. Okay? Definitely, this is the hook in the jaw for Gog Magog. Now, let's go ahead and talk about China and their Silk Road, the extension of their Silk Road through Israel. And if you'll look here, it begins down in Eilat at the very southern tip of Israel, Eliot, and runs all the way up to Ashdod. Okay? This is a high-speed rail system as an extension of the Silk Road for China. Because to the left of this image, of course, is Egypt and the Suez Canal, which is a very slow transit for tankers, for ships. And Egypt controls it, and they charge a lot of money for the transit of the Suez. China wants to bypass that with a high-speed rail system so they don't have to use ships passing through the Suez in a very slow, plodding transit. And they don't have to pay those high fees. They view it as less expensive and certainly more efficient to go ahead and build a high-speed rail system through Israel. When did you ever think you would hear Israel and China being partners? Well, here it is. This has been in the works for about 5 years now. This negotiation between Israel and China to build this rail system. It will carry passengers, but primarily freight. Primarily, it's going to extend their ability to move freight to Europe. The extension of the Silk Road. Okay? So, if we take all of this and we look at Damascus at the very top and Syria, and we have the Golan separating Syria and Israel. We've got Jordan down here, Lebanon, and part of Egypt. Remember we talked about the Levant, the promised land? What you're looking at here is the promised land. This is the Levant. This is what the Zionist political movement in Israel wants to achieve. They want to take over Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and part of Egypt in order to extend and envelop and realize their promised land. Okay? So, Israel's making this multi-billion-dollar deal to export now this direction on the Mediterranean Sea from there off their coast to the left where it says Mediterranean Sea is Cyprus. Okay? Cyprus is the last EU member fully isolated from energy interconnections, and it is expected that it will be connected to European networks via the Euro-Asian Interconnector, a 2,000 megawatt undersea power cable. Euro-Asia Interconnector will connect Greek, Cypriot, and Israeli power grids. Okay, this is an electrical connection, undersea power cable. It is a leading project of common interest of the European Union and also priority of the Electricity Highway Interconnector project. I'm reading from Wikipedia on Cyprus. In recent years, significant quantities of offshore natural gas have been discovered in the area known as Aphrodite at the exploratory drilling block 12. In Cyprus's exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, about 175 kilometers or 109 miles south of Limassol. However, Turkey's offshore drilling companies have accessed both natural gas and oil resources since 2013. Cyprus demarcated its maritime border with Egypt in 2003 and with Lebanon in 2007 and with Israel in 2010. In August of 2011, the U.S.-based firm Noble Energy entered into a production sharing agreement with the Cypriot government regarding the block's commercial development. That was Block 12. For the Cypriot discovery. If you look up Noble Energy, if this is the first time you've heard of them, they are the ones that are contracting. This is a U.S. company contracting with Israel to develop the natural gas and the crude oil deposits in the Leviathan field. It was Noble Energy that first made the discovery on behalf of and under contract with Israel. That goes back, I want to say, about 10 years from my memory, that Noble Energy made that first discovery. Okay, so let's go on with Wikipedia. Turkey, which does not recognize the border agreements of Cyprus with its neighbors, threatened to mobilize its naval forces if Cyprus proceeded with plans to begin drilling in Block 12. Cyprus's drilling efforts have the support of the United States, the EU, and the UN, and on 19 September 2011, drilling in Block 12 began without any incidents being reported. Because of the heavy influx of tourists and foreign investors, the property rental market in Cyprus has grown in recent years, and they go on to talk about that. So it's a desirable location for a lot of reasons. Okay, let's go up to some of the conflict that had occurred. Okay. Give me a moment. Here we go. 1974 coup, Turkish invasion and division. On 15 July 1974, the Greek military junta under Dimitrios Ioannidis carried out a coup d'etat in Cyprus to unite the island with Greece. The coup ousted President Makarios III and replaced him with pro-Enos nationalist Nikos Sampson. In response to the coup, 5 days later, on 20 July 1974, the Turkish army invaded the island, citing a right to intervene to restore the constitutional order from the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee. This justification had been and has been rejected by the United Nations and the international community. The Turkish Air Force began bombing Greek positions in Cyprus, and hundreds of paratroopers were dropped in the area between Nicosia and Kyrenia, where well-armed Turkish Cypriot enclaves had been long established. While off the Kyrenia coast, Turkish troop ships landed 6,000 men as well as tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles. 3 days later, when a ceasefire had been agreed, Turkey had landed 30,000 troops on the island and captured Kyrenia, the corridor linking Kyrenia to Nicosia, and the Turkish Cypriot quarter of Nicosia itself. The junta in Athens and then the Sampson regime in Cyprus fell from power. In Nicosia, I can't pronounce his name, assumed the presidency and constitutional order was restored, removing the pretext for the Turkish invasion. But after the peace negotiations in Geneva, the Turkish government reinforced their Kyrenia bridgehead and started a second invasion on 14 August. The invasion resulted in the seizure of Moropu, Karpas, Famagusta, and Mesarea. International pressure led to a ceasefire, and by then 36% of the island had been taken over by the Turks, and 180,000 Greek Cypriots had been evicted from their homes in the north. At the same time, around 50,000 Turkish Cypriots were displaced to the north and settled in the properties of the displaced Greek Cypriots. Among a variety of sanctions against Turkey in mid-1975, the U.S. Congress imposed an arms embargo on Turkey for using U.S.-supplied equipment during the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974. Okay, so you get a picture of this. I won't go on. There's quite a bit more. If you want to look at what has been going on since this division, go ahead and look at Cyprus in Wikipedia. What I want to offer to you after giving you that backdrop is that Russia is not going to sit still. They have their partner nation, as I said, the Turks to the north, and they have their military presence, the Russians do, in the south. The fact that Israel and the Cypriots to the south, not the Turks to the north, the Cypriots to the south, which are Greek Cypriots in the south, the Russians are going to put the squeeze on the island. The Israelis are mentioned in this article that came out today. But the Russians are not, as I said, and the U.S. are not mentioned in this article, in this agreement. But when you say Israel, you're saying the United States. Remember, I said that over a month ago, President Trump, signed a first-time agreement with Israel as a mutual defense agreement. So anything that Israel does is now locked in with the United States. The United States is locked in with Israel. Should the Russians put the squeeze on the Israelis, beginning on the island of Cyprus, the U.S. will be drawn into this. And we have an ally, not just the Greek Cypriots, not just Israel, but we have a very small United Kingdom contingent to the south. And in the north, the radar base, which is right about where Nicosia is, the radar installation, and then the UK and NATO base down here to the south. They will be the first ones to respond literally in two directions. The Russians here with their Air Force and two naval installations here and here. The UK will be the first ones to respond to the Russians, and certainly the United States. So I'm giving you the heads up. We're looking at this biblically, prophetically. We're looking at this strategically from a military standpoint, and we're looking at it economically with regards to the pipeline for natural gas running from Cyprus to Europe. Now, the initial shipping, of course, shipment of natural gas will be by sea, by ship. But the plan is to build a pipeline from Cyprus to Europe. The Russians want to do that, just like they want to do that in Syria. Therefore, the Russians have to take somebody out of this chess match. It's obvious who they need to take out. Israel. Again, the hook in the jaw. They can't resist this. And I've said for years, Cyprus was going to be the starting point for this entire conflict between Russia and Israel. Take a look at this graphic. It involves the UK and Russia while I go and bring in something new. We have to talk about Iran. Iran is an ally of Russia. Russia has a mutual defense treaty with Iran. We're going to talk about Iran next in this chess match. We're definitely flying on patch air at 40,000 feet here tonight, folks. We might talk a little bit about artificial intelligence as we get along, but I want to look at this geopolitical situation. I'm going to go down through and give you a list of things that are going on with Iran and the United States. So we're going to shift gears just slightly, but remember, when we talk about Israel, we're talking about the U.S. and vice versa. When we talk about Iran, we're talking about Russia and vice versa. All of those players are focused on, of course, Israel. And now I'm encouraging you to pay attention to Cyprus. Okay? Let's start with the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. This took place on Tuesday. See if I can get to the article here. After protesters stormed the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, shouting "Death to America," Donald Trump says Iran will pay a very big price. This comes from USA Today, dated December 31st, authored by John Bacon. Just going to give you some excerpts. Demonstrators shouting "Death to America" smashed their way into the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad on Tuesday as protests intensified after U.S. airstrikes killed 25 fighters of an Iran-backed militia in Iraq. No deaths or serious injuries were immediately reported at the protest. The Pentagon said it rushed reinforcements to the embassy and an Army Apache AH-64 attack helicopters swooped over the complex. By early evening Tuesday, the mob had retreated from the compound, but set up several tents outside for a sit-in. Pardon me. Dozens of yellow flags belonging to Iran-backed Shiite militias fluttered atop the reception area and were plastered along the embassy's concrete wall, along with anti-U.S. graffiti. Iraqi Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi, who condemned the airstrikes, had urged militiamen and their supporters to leave the embassy area and halt the violence. All right, so that gives you an overview. It's what Donald Trump said that is most alarming, okay? Let me get to that. Let's see what I can find here. I want to quote the president. December 31st, President Trump, Iran will be held fully responsible for lives lost or damage incurred at any of our facilities. They will pay a very, and in all caps, this is of course a tweet, in all caps, big price. This is not a warning. It is a threat. Happy New Year. That's our president talking to the Iranians. Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei tweeted his response on January 1st and said, "You can't do anything." All right. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo postponed a trip to the Ukraine this week in order to keep a closer eye on developments in Iraq, the State Department said Wednesday. Okay. Pompeo, Esper, and former National Security Advisor John Bolton met with President Trump in the Oval Office back in August to try to convince him that it was in the U.S. interest to release the approximate $400 million in military aid to Ukraine. But Trump refused. That was reported on December 29th in the New York Times. I'm giving you snippets just to give you an overview of what's going on there. You can see that it's ramping up. The heat's being turned up, folks. On December 27th, and this is what prompted the airstrike by the U.S., December 27th, a U.S. contractor was killed in a rocket attack at an Iraqi base near Kirkuk on Friday. It was the latest of nearly a dozen such attacks in recent months. Okay? December 29th, the Pentagon officials said the U.S. blamed Iranian-backed Shiite militias under the banner of Hezbollah and dispatched airstrikes on 5 of those militias' bases in Iraq and Syria. More than 24 KH fighters are believed to have been killed in those airstrikes. The airstrikes then triggered some 48 hours of protests and increasingly violent demonstrations at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. At that time, an undetermined number of demonstrators reached the reception area, where guards screen all visitors to the embassy before they were prevented from breaching the compound. Then, about 100 Marines flew to the embassy via V-22 Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft. Now, that's not the only ramp-up that's going on, folks. Let me get to another one. CBS reported an additional 3,000 troops were preparing to deploy to Kuwait. Now, we haven't heard about Kuwait in a long time. 3,000 troops to Kuwait. But orders for that deployment had not been issued as of Tuesday morning. Reuters was reporting separately that there could be as many as 4,000 more U.S. troops headed to the region. Esper's justification, quote, "This deployment is an appropriate and precautionary action taken in response to increased threat levels against U.S. personnel and facilities such as we witnessed in Baghdad today. The United States will protect our people and interests anywhere they are found around the world." Now let's back up just a little bit for some perspective. Deployment is appropriate and precautionary action taken in response to increased threat levels. We know about regime changes from within, promoted by the CIA. We're not talking about a regime change in Iraq, but we are looking at the efforts by the CIA for a regime change in Iran. Now you have Iranian offspring, if you will, the Shiite troops, the civilians supposedly, but troops nonetheless, who attacked the largest U.S. embassy in the world. As George pointed out before we went on the air this evening in the chat room, that embassy is much larger than it needs to be. And we've covered this maybe 6 months ago. Kathleen and I were showing you photographs of the embassy and some of the symbolism associated with its architecture. But the point being is, it's much bigger than it needs to be for a country of that size, the country of Iraq. And as George rightly stated, the United States is never going to leave Iraq. That's why there's such a large presence there of military troops as well as State Department workers and contractors, former military personnel as contractors that work out of that U.S. embassy. So you've got to ask yourself, the largest embassy that the U.S. has, foreign embassy obviously, why would the Marine contingent force, the Marines around the world, are responsible for guarding each of the embassies of the United States around the world. And as you know, any nation, especially the United States, any nation's footprint within a foreign country making up their embassy compound is considered that country's sovereign soil. Why would the United States, why would the State Department, why would they allow what is not said in these articles, but I'm saying is a stand down by the U.S. Marines to allow an invasion into U.S. sovereign territory onto the embassy grounds and reach the reception area within the compound itself? That begs a question, doesn't it? Think about what the CIA does around the world. This takes us to false flags. I'm calling this a false flag. This protest, which really is an invasion of U.S. sovereign soil, sovereign territory. You know that if the Marines were not told to stand down, they would have repelled every one of those with all force necessary, especially with the largest embassy that the U.S. has. The fact that they made it to the reception area screams false flag to me. Now, I'm no expert, I'm just giving my opinion. But why call it a false flag? Look at the response of Donald Trump. Look at the movement into Kuwait of 3,000 to 4,000 more troops. And there are also more troops being moved into Iraq. We already moved most of our troops, except those that are guarding the natural gas and crude oil pumping stations east of Damascus in Syria, but virtually all of our other troops were moved out of Syria into Iraq. And there was this hue and cry about, we've abandoned the Kurds, a supposed U.S. ally. Well, the Kurds have been slaughtering Christians throughout the Middle East. Iran, Iraq, and in Syria and in Turkey. So the Kurds are not allies of Christians. But now what you're seeing with this false flag against the U.S. Embassy is the reason that our troops were pulled out of Syria, most of them. Basically, what we have left there are special forces and an armored brigade of armored personnel carrier and some tanks. But mostly special forces troops in Syria. The rank and file infantry, if you will, has been pulled back into Iraq. Iraq is a staging area for the buildup of more military troops and equipment for an invasion of Iran. This is why it's a false flag. Iran is being blamed, being painted as having invaded the United States sovereign territory in Iraq. That's an act of war, plain and simple. We're going to have to watch closely what's going to happen as the troop buildup increases in Kuwait and in Iraq itself. Because Kuwait is just a point of delivery for those troops. They're deployed from that staging area in Kuwait. Now we have Cyprus. Remember, we're at 40,000 feet and we're watching all of the pieces on the chessboard. They interconnect and they interplay. Donald Trump is developing an excuse for the invasion of Iran. Remember, Iran's ally is Russia. Russia's moving south with the Turkish troops through Syria towards Israel already. Now, essentially, you have an invasion of the U.S. in Iraq, blamed on Iran. Their proxies, the Hezbollah, labeled as civilians. Well, those proxies are there by way of the influence and payoff in U.S. dollars by the CIA to conduct this assault. You see, the Marines were told, and you're not going to see this in the media, but because the Marines did not repel these supposed civilian protesters, they were told to stand down. I'm being repetitive, but I'm making a point. If the Marines had fired on, used lethal force against these supposed civilians, they actually would be killing people that are there at the behest, are being paid by the U.S. government, by the CIA, to invade the compound of the U.S. Embassy. Essentially, the Marines would be firing on their own people. That's how it's looked upon in the diplomatic circles. Friendly fire in military circles. Therefore, the Marines were told to stand down. CIA had already told these people, you can go as far as the reservation desk area, but you're not going any further into the building. That's the plan. That's the agreement. All you need to do is get on to the sovereign soil so that there is a excuse, a picture painted in the international community that the U.S. has been invaded by Iran. Now Donald Trump has all the pieces on the chessboard that he needs. He's got his troops coming in. He has pre-positioned troops already moved down in through from Syria into Iraq. Now you have the Russians being stirred up because they're looking at being locked out of Cyprus and the natural gas over there. And they're already moving towards the Golan with the Turks. And the Turks on Cyprus are going to want to move on Israel, both on Cyprus and in Syria, into the Golan on Israel. There's a two-pronged approach here, folks, moving in simultaneous parallel tracks. Cyprus on the one hand, Israel, the Golan Heights on the other. We need to pay close attention to this. The false flag has already been committed against Iran. I'm sorry, my camera is not focusing here very well. The U.S. has been invaded. I'm always talking about referencing, using the example, the analogy of dominoes. The dominoes are continuing to fall in the Middle East. I'm going to make this a short broadcast tonight. I'm going to go to the chat room. If you guys have questions, go ahead and prepare them. I'm not going to launch into the AI discussion tonight. I think it'll take away from the impact of what I'm trying to convey to you tonight of this false flag. I don't know if others, I haven't looked, Kathleen and I have been really busy today. I haven't looked out into the YouTube land and into the broader internet to see if others are labeling this as a false flag against Iran. But I am tonight. I think I've made my case. But go ahead and prepare your questions, and I'll get into the chat room. We'll take whatever time you like to go back and forth on some of your topics, and they can be completely unrelated to what I've presented so far. But again, I don't want to lessen the impact of what I'm asking you to pay attention to by getting into a technology discussion. We can always do that later. There's plenty to talk about. Okay. Did this strategic landing start with Bush Sr. or before? I think that's what Rise and Shine is saying. Yes. Ever since the early 80s and the Iran-Iraq conflict was taking place, pretty much throughout the 1980s, this was reaching back to 1979 under Jimmy Carter. I was in the U.S. Army at that time under Carter. And because of the hostage crisis in Iran, I was just discharged, honorably, of course, from the U.S. Army. And I got a recall notice. And the group that I was assigned to, we were told that we were going to be deployed to Iran in 1970. This was 1980 now, January of 1980. I was issued a recall from my discharge, and our orders were to go to Iran into the desert because we were going to be moving nuclear warheads. Excuse me. The United States was going to move nuclear warheads into temporary storage facilities in the middle of the desert in Iran. And I was part of a military police contingency force that was charged with the nuclear surety, S-U-R-E-T-Y, of nuclear devices. And so we were put on a recall and to deploy. The hostage crisis was resolved just after Jimmy Carter left office and Ronald Reagan came into office. And ever since then, the U.S. has been hell-bent on invading Iran. Remember, the Shah of Iran was placed in the early 1970s. I think it was 1971. Correct me. Just from memory. Early 70s, the Shah of Iran, through the CIA, was put in place as a puppet leader of Iran. Then there was a coup. There was an overthrow by the Ayatollah Khomeini, not the current Khomeini, previous one, and there's where the hostage crisis began. And ever since then, the UN has been wanting to kick butt in revenge for the hostage crisis in 1978-79 and ending in early 1980. I remember it very clearly, the hostage crisis, because I was in the military at the time. And it really looked like we were going to go to war with Iran over this. And when we lost our helicopters in the desert, because they collided at night in the desert, we essentially had invaded Iran at that point to try to rescue the hostages. But the taking of the hostages was an act of war And the U.S. was prepared to use tactical nuclear devices against Iran at that point in 1979. And I was wrapped up in that because of the security part of the planning. I wasn't doing the planning. I was just, a grunt soldier doing what he was ordered to do. But when the hostage crisis ended, I went back to civilian life. Okay. That was just a little story to kind of help you with that. All righty, let's see. Planning. Yeah. Dr. Darnell asked, do I think that they'll enact the draft? No. There's not enough time to enact a draft, go through the legislation, number one, set up the draft boards, go through the drafting process to be of any benefit. Draft is typically necessary when you need a lot of boots on the ground. You need a lot of physical bodies, a lot of rank and file military members. That isn't necessary now because of technology, because of our not just tactical nuke situation, but our air capability, our special forces capability, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, etc., etc. Our ability to operate covertly with small specialized forces negates the necessity for larger standing armies, so we don't really need a draft. And the technology takes over for the boots on the ground. Plus, we're so spread out already, the U.S. is, all over the world, policing the world, that technology has really been the answer to boots on the ground. So the logistics of a draft are too long in its implementation. And then if you did have a draft and you drafted thousands of men, you have to train them. And that takes upwards to a year just for their basic and advanced individual training to take place. So the ability to put boots on the ground would be at least 2 years from right now if they started today. That would be a rough estimate. Okay? All right. Andy is asking, doesn't the U.S. know that it's unwise to invade Iran after all the trouble in Afghanistan? Well, it's interesting you asked that question because we're already pulling out of Afghanistan. Just in the last couple of weeks, there have been much larger troop movements out of Afghanistan. Where are they going? Iraq. Think of Iraq as a point of embarkation. This is almost like D-Day, folks. The invasion of the beaches of Normandy, etc., etc. Omaha Beach, okay? This time they're not using landing craft and ships offshore, LSTs and things like that. Now they're using missiles, short-range ballistic missiles, aircraft, fighters and bombers, interceptors. But primarily this will be a missile attack and then followed by boots on the ground. I've said all along that when Israel detects a strike coming on Israel proper, specifically targeting Tel Aviv, when Israel detects a launch coming out of Syria over the Golan Heights by Hezbollah, the proxy troops of Iran, and because of the association, Russia and Turkey, upon detection by Israel, by the IDF, of an attack, missile attack, they will simultaneously, as they pass by one another, they will simultaneously launch tactical nukes into Syria against Iran, Hezbollah, and Turkish and Russian troops, and Syrian troops, of course. When that attack over the Golan by Israel in response to its detection, it's almost a preemptive, but they're going to wait for the launch detection or the imminent launching detected. It will be an almost preemptive strike by Israel, but not just towards Syria, but also towards where? Iran. Okay? They're going to strike Tehran. Now, our navies, we have two carrier groups, carrier task forces, off the coast of Iran right now. They have to prevent the Strait of Hormuz from being blocked, either by mines or by swift boats or by missile attacks from the land, closing the Strait of Hormuz. So the Navy presence by the United States and other allies will also be launching against Iran from the sea. Multi-pronged, simultaneous. Donald Trump, false flag, now has the excuse. He has more ammunition. Is he going to do it immediately? Probably not. Troops from Afghanistan, more troops from the U.S. that are already landing in Kuwait as we speak. The build-up's going on, okay? How deep into the earth can our satellites see? Rise and Shine is asking. Interesting question. It depends. Okay, I'll get to Susan's question next. Geosynchronous satellites doing what is known as geospatial detection. If they're using lasers, which is the latest technology, instead of radar, they can penetrate up to a mile from the information that I know, probably deeper, but with laser imaging, they are able to penetrate at least a mile into the earth from satellites. Radar, as you know, reflects. It doesn't penetrate too well. If you have a surface ground-mounted radar, you can do what is known as a surface penetration or ground-based radar, and you can bounce from the topsoil into the deeper soil, but that's very limited. I mean, I think that the numbers I've seen are 100 feet, maybe 300 feet, but that's a radar system that is on the surface of the ground directing down into the earth. But from satellite, rather than radar, are laser and LIDAR systems, LIDAR. LIDAR can penetrate up to a mile. Susan is asking, when you suspected years ago that Cyprus would be such an important location, was that based on sheer logic, or were there other factors that gave you that insight? I think it's military logic, primarily. You know, sort of role-playing. If I were a general, if I were an admiral, where would I want to place my troops strategically in the Mediterranean to control the sea, but also to be able to reach out to the Turkish coast to the north and down along into Syria and along into Israel and into Egypt? Where could I best launch out into the Middle East from? And have a point of operation that is relatively safe. It's kind of like a castle with a moat. Cyprus being the castle and the Mediterranean being the moat. An offshore point at which you can launch aircraft, not just ships, but aircraft primarily, I chose Cyprus for the book. Now, in the book, they aren't launching from Cyprus, but the Navy SEALs, a very small group, land on the island of Cyprus because this is the point of location for the controlling quantum computer for a group of 7 quantum computers that end up in Turkey at each of the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation by John from the island of Patmos. So I borrow from the book of Revelation for the quantum computers part of it, but militarily, strategically, and logically picking Cyprus in order to reach out and control the Middle Eastern countries. Okay? Alrighty. Does the Tesla dome exist? Rise and Shine is asking. No, not at this point. Can drones locate guns or rifles in your house? Drones. Well, I'm sure you're talking about the large drones that are deployed by the military, not the little tiny drones. If you had a LiDAR equipped drone, like a Predator drone, you could locate weapons within a home. Okay? Because the metal is highly reflective. So, yeah, not an issue. When you look at Predator drones and others like that that are used in the Middle East, not only are they obviously equipped with infrared and they're able to pinpoint the heat coming off human bodies inside of a building, but they can pinpoint the weaponry using LiDAR within the buildings themselves. And typically, we're looking at buildings with, multiple feet of thickness of dried clay and mud in many of these instances. Okay? Alrighty. Clarify why the U.S. would benefit from a war or attacking Iran. Good question. Oil, natural gas. They want the oil, just like Donald Trump has said in Syria. The oil is ours. In Syria, thumbing his nose at Bashar al-Assad, president, dictator of Syria, just thumbs his nose and said, hey, we're going to send in our military and we're going to surround those natural gas and crude oil pumping stations, and we're going to bring in a U.S. oil and natural gas company to do it right. That's what he said. That's almost, it's not really parenthetically, that's almost verbatim. To do it right. Claiming the oil of Syria as our own, the U.S. own property. Same thing, pick it up and apply it to Iran. They need an excuse. The president needs an excuse. But it is always about control of oil and natural gas. Imagine snatching that away from Russia. If Russia loses revenue from oil and natural gas coming out of Iran, if Russia loses that source of revenue, it'll collapse the Russian economy. Plain and simple. That's why Russia has a mutual defense treaty with Iran. It isn't because they love each other. It's because they have a mutual interest. Iran wants to sell oil and natural gas to Russia. Remember, we've talked an awful lot in the past about sanctions being the big stick that Donald Trump is able to wield. Well, there are sanctions against countries purchasing oil and gas from Iran. Russia doesn't care. Russia has to have it. And Russia has to have more oil and natural gas. Hook in the jaw. Ezekiel 38. Okay? Iran may be planning more attacks on American interests in the Middle East, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said today. Michael is citing that quote. Absolutely. You see? Anthony, do you think that AI is running this whole thing? Carolyn's asking. No, this is still all being run by people, but AI plays a significant role, not in the planning, not in the strategy, and I think that's more germane to your question. I think is AI running scenarios? Are they wargaming? To that extent, AI definitely is employed in wargaming, but the control is still in the hands of people. So AI is not in control, but it's offering up different chessboard scenarios. Remember, AlphaGo, chessboard scenarios. It can run millions of iterations of possible moves. That's what it did with AlphaGo and AlphaGo 2. That's being applied right here. But it's not infallible. It can come up with all kinds of different moves, different strategies for moves, but none of them are infallible. AI is not infallible. Why? Because AI doesn't know the mind of God. It doesn't know what God's military plan is. Certainly, reading the book of Revelation gives us, and if you will, AI, to just to sort of be euphemistic here, knows the book of Revelation. But Revelation is not specific in the timing. That's why it's so confusing to read Revelation. But we know what is coming. We know how it's going to work out. So AI can come up with all the different military strategies and all of the wargaming it wants, but it doesn't know the plan, therefore the timing of God. Okay? Doesn't Israel want that fuel, meaning the oil and the natural gas? Absolutely. They want it for their own domestic applications, but they don't need all of it. Therefore, the excess is exported, and those monies, euros, British pound, US dollars, the petro dollar, the US reserve dollar, flows into Israel. Israel's already very wealthy. Don't be fooled if you get emails and things from people in Israel, organizations in Israel saying, oh, the poor people here and the orphans over here and the students over here and all of this. Forget about it. The GDP, the gross domestic product in Israel, the average citizen in Israel is better than the average citizen in the United States. Israel's already very wealthy, and it is slated to become the richest nation on the planet. Gold, oil, natural gas. To be the wellspring of all of the oil for the Middle East, in the Golan, controlled by Israel, what if they turn off the taps? What if, using technology, they're able to stop the flow from its source to the remainder of the Middle East? I would imagine they have the technology to do that. And I imagine this is why the Saudis, the folks in Qatar, Kuwait, and even Egypt are playing nice with Israel right now. You're not going to see that on YouTube. You're not going to read that on the internet. But let's think logically again. Why would countries that have been at odds with Israel for hundreds of years, but certainly during the petroleum years, let's call it. Egypt, if you'll recall, in the 60s and in the 70s, was an ally of the then Soviet Union and tried to invade Israel, the Six-Day War. Okay? I'm not being condescending here. I'm just kind of emphasizing the fact that Israel's been under attack for a long time, but its enemies now are playing nice. I think they've been held hostage. I think that Israel has the technology to cut off the flow of oil through the sands, so to speak. Boy, if they could do that, it would bankrupt these other countries. But obviously that would bring war down on them. Well, war's coming anyway to Israel. But God will supernaturally intervene, but I think that they're going to lose upwards. Initially, they're going to lose upwards of 1 million people. And that's going to be in the Ezekiel 38-39 scenario. Later on is Gog Magog. Okay? Later on. First, we've got to get past Jeremiah 49 and Isaiah 17, which is the destruction of Damascus overnight. And that's being set up for right now. It's already a heap of ruins, but the final destruction, because remember, I've cited for you, in Damascus, underground, are the command and control bunkers for the Syrian military. Those are still intact and operational. Okay? All right. Weren't we friends with Iran in early 1900s? What happened? Carolyn's asking. Yes, all the way up until, as I was mentioning, the CIA putting their puppet, the Shah of Iran, in the late 60s and early 70s into power. And with the Iran-Iraq war going on during the 80s, the U.S. was siding with Iran, supporting Iran. Okay? So, we took out Gaddafi, took over Iraq. Now we want to take over Iran because really we didn't like the coup that took place and the hostage situation, and that has left a sour taste in the State Department's mouth ever since then. So there's revenge, but the primary thing working here is oil. Okay? Alrighty. This news just breaking. Breaking news. Official Iraqi TV announces the killing of Qassam Soleimani, commander of the Quds force. No kidding. Qassam Soleimani, the commander of the Quds force. Well, we had the false flag at the embassy. Now we have this. Let's see. Got it, Michael. Relevant breaking news. Thank you, Michael. Got it. Yep. Was Gaddafi really bad? Carolyn's asking. Yes, he was a dictator. Anybody who opposed him. Think about what happens in China. Think about what happens in North Korea. Happened under Gaddafi. Anybody that was opposing him, including their family members, not just immediate but extensive family members, slaughtered and wiped out. And that's not just propaganda. So, there was a certain amount of stability, I'll grant you that, in Iraq under Khomeini. A certain amount of stability. Did he need to be deposed? Did he need to be captured? Did we need to go to war there? No. Regime change takes on many faces or many approaches to it. Again, CIA working within, that's one way. Elections, diplomacy, economic sanctions, a rising from within of the general population in dissatisfaction of their leadership, civil strife, civil war within a country. All of those things can take place to overthrow a dictator if the people want that. The U.S. had no business invading Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction, whether they were there or moved to Syria, it's irrelevant. We invaded for the oil. We're going to invade Iran for the oil. It's all about controlling natural resources. But from the Christian perspective, this is all about a proxy war to bring in the Antichrist. Remember the dominoes. There needs to be war to bring on economic collapse, to bring in the debt reset, to bring in the one world economy, the one world currency of Libra, and the one world leader. All of those happening in rapid succession, but certainly following the debt reset, there will be a concurrent establishment of a one world economy and currency, along with concurrently the establishment of the Antichrist leadership, the Antichrist figure. We are seeing right here in this live stream dominoes falling live right here. Okay? Alrighty. Gaddafi created water systems that started turning his country into the breadbasket of Africa. He was creating a gold dinar, D-I-N-A-R, dinar, which is now completely worthless, but a gold-based, I think you're trying to say, George, gold-backed dinar to be independent of the U.S. dollar, which we did not allow. Agreed. He was trying to pull away from the reserve currency, the petrodollar, and that incensed the U.S. government because it was pulling away from the revenue that the U.S. was earning through the petrodollar system. But behind the petrodollar, obviously, is the oil itself. So, yes, I agree with you, George. It was because he was trying to set up his own dinar. And, you know, there are people out there who keep saying that invest in the dinar because someday it'll become fabulously valuable, the dinar. It'll never happen. So don't let people suck you into some of those investment schemes in the dinar. It'll never come back. Okay? George, and you know what happened to Lincoln and Kennedy. Yep. Didn't Trump vow to get us out of the Middle East? Why is he destroying 7 nations? Why Sudan destruction? Carolyn's asking. He did, but you know, every politician, when they're campaigning, their platforms are always several planks in the platform or outright lies just to get them elected. The military-industrial complex is so entrenched. I mean, that's far beyond the swamp he talks about. Is so entrenched that there is no way. Think about it economically. Our country is a war country, a war-based country, a military-based country. And I'm speaking as a veteran. I'm not speaking against the military. I'm talking about the industry of war. Our economy is predominantly, if not solely, based upon war. If we stop going to war, fomenting wars and going to war, our economy would completely collapse. But so are all of the countries of the world. All of the countries are military, industrial, complex, oriented, and they're all debt-based. And they're all going to collapse simultaneously because that's the plan. It's the only way to bring about a single control system under a single leader. Okay? Iran's been around way longer than the U.S. Does the U.S. have a chance? Yeah, they do. The U.S. does have a chance because it and Israel have the technology. Didn't you say Israel wanted a war for the oil? Yes, Israel, the Zionist agenda is to control the oil of the Middle East. Absolutely. Absolutely. Israel wants a war with Iran. But when we say Israel, we are saying the U.S. at the same time. The U.S.-Israeli interests are merged. There is that agreement, mutual defense agreement, that I cited earlier. Israel and the United States want the Iranian oil. Okay? The U.S. is supporting Israel. Israel is the head. Israel leads and controls the United States, not the other way around. The U.S. is supporting economically and, of course, militarily the Zionist goals of Israel. But Israel is in control of the United States. Why were we destroying the Sudan? Well, you have to knock out the militaries of the Sudan in order to control the resources. Okay? Do we realize the suffering of the Sudanese people? It's irrelevant. Certainly there are people like you and I that are aware of it, but those that are in control of our militaries, they don't care about the suffering of humans, because those at the very top that are in control are Luciferian. The Luciferians don't care about human life. So the suffering is irrelevant to them. Yes, Deborah is saying Iraq is their landing zone. Absolutely. Their point of embarkation. Okay, so what's going on in Africa, Carolyn is saying? In the Sudan and in the Central African Republic is where the predominant, and South Africa, the predominant death and carnage is taking place. It's not happening in the north, in Libya and well, there's still strife in Libya, but not in Libya and Egypt to the north, but South Africa still. The killing of the whites in South Africa is still going on. The Central African Republic, about, 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, was fairly peaceful, but it has been nothing but destruction, civil destruction, internal destruction for the last at least 8 years, maybe more. And in the Sudan, of course. You look at those areas and you look at their natural resources and you see why this is going on. Now, I mentioned China earlier and the extension of the Silk Road, the high-speed rail up through what I call the spine of Israel. China is all over Africa, but especially in the south. So when you look at what's going on, you have to look at the investments by China in South Africa. China has invested in buying up gold mines and diamond mines and going after the natural gas deposits as well. The Chinese are no friends of the Africans. Israel has nuclear weapons buried in the basements of its embassies around the world, including the U.S. That is why we do what they order, according to George. Okay? Will Israel be able to stop a missile attack if launched? Is it something the Iron Dome can deal with? Deborah is asking. The Iron Dome does pretty well with small rocket, well, not small rockets, small missiles, missiles that have a range of 100 to 300 miles. Small, short-range missiles. The Iron Dome is designed for the little rockets. Okay, we talk about rocket, we're talking about things about this big in diameter, about this long, that Hezbollah keeps launching. The Palestinians keep launching into Israel. The rocket attacks are basically just mortar attacks more than anything else. Iron Dome doesn't address that. It is for high altitude interception of short range missiles. So we're talking something that's 60 feet long and 15 feet in diameter. I mean, I'm just throwing some numbers out there. Iron Dome is essentially the Patriot missile system on steroids. It uses a phased array radar antenna system to track and pinpoint fast-moving objects and then be able to guide an intercepting missile to destroy an incoming missile in midair. That's the Iron Dome. The counter to that is a swarm attack. You overwhelmingly deploy missiles from a variety of directions simultaneously. So the answer is no. There is a limitation to the Iron Dome. This is why I've said for several years now that I believe Tel Aviv is the principal target, and therefore there will be 1 million people that will be killed in Tel Aviv and its area, surrounding area, by tactical nukes that get through the Iron Dome. To date, these have been high explosive warheads on these missiles that the Iron Dome has been successfully intercepting. But there are not enough of those phased array systems, I'm trying to reach for the word, emplacements. Therefore, there is a limited number of missiles. And so there will be missiles that will get through that have nuclear warheads on the tips of those missiles. They won't be little rockets. Deborah's asking, do you have any idea what the effects will be on the U.S., or does that depend on what goes down? Well, much has been said by many pastors and preachers that the United States is not found in the book of Revelation. It's not found in the Bible. It's been oftentimes said that the military and economic capabilities of the United States will be reduced down to about 10% of what it is today. Those are the kinds of scenarios that I've been aware of, that 90% of the economy and the military will be destroyed during the time of the book of Revelation. Ezekiel 38:39 to be specific. Therefore, that indicates that the U.S. homeland, the physical United States, will be attacked. Now, there's a lot of discussion about sleeper cells, foreign troops already here, including Russian and Chinese. George was mentioning, that it's his contention, I don't know about this, but his contention that the Israelis have a nuke in every embassy. I don't know about that. Are there pre-positioned nuclear devices in major cities? I don't know. Somehow, some way, the United States suffers mightily. And I think we're already all aware of that probability. It's a pretty somber live stream we're doing tonight. I don't make any apologies for that. I'm just bringing to you what I consider to be the facts. But all the more reason to be prayed up, as they often say. All the more reason to be right with God, all the more reason to reach out to other people for their salvation. There just is not that much time remaining. It's not for us to be fearful. We're accounted for by God. We're provided for by God. And we are told in Scripture that we are to be filled with joy when we see what is coming upon us, when we see the birth pangs, when we, in my parlance, the falling of the dominoes in rapid succession. We are to be filled with joy because it is portending the return of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. There's a lot that has to happen first. Most of it isn't very good. Okay. Alrighty. Qassam Soleimani reportedly killed in Baghdad airport. Militia leader blames Israel and the U.S. Again, very, very serious turn of events. They're trying to take out the leadership. They're trying to take out the leadership of Iran. You know, cutting off the head of the snake approach. Before an invasion, if you can take out the command and control centers, if you can take out the controllers, if you can take out the military leaders, confusion reigns, chaos reigns within the ranks. Not just because there isn't clear direction, but there's also infighting as opportunists try to maneuver for positions of control within the military and within the government when the heads are eliminated. Okay, the opportunity to strike, internal strife within Iran. That chaos and confusion, along with the military confusion, that tells us that they're getting ready to attack Iran. There will be more heads being cut off. There will be more military leaders that are going to be killed. You can bet on that before the actual attack is launched. So watch for those assassinations, because that's plain and simple what they are. Okay? Alrighty. Soleimani was their number one Iranian general. Yep, take off the head. There are a lot of people scrambling for bunkers right now in Iran and in Syria. Bunker buster bombs, high explosive as well as tactical nuclear. That's what you can expect for taking out the guys that are in the bunkers, because that's where they have all scrambled to. I mean, that's just logic. In order to reach the leadership and the command and control centers themselves, bunker buster bombs dropped from high altitude utilize high explosives to initially penetrate the soils, further detonate to penetrate hardened concrete, reinforced concrete ceilings that are buried underground, the top layer. And once that weapon penetrates the roof through the concrete, it then enters the void in the bunker, and then the nuke detonates inside the bunker. That's a bunker buster scenario. Combination of high explosive HE and nuclear weapons. Okay? Alrighty, guys. Any last minute questions? Something you would like me to hear or know about, and we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Again, yes, Carolyn, prayers for mothers and fathers of the young people in the military. Prayers for the folks in Australia with the fire that they're dealing with. Okay. All right, guys. Time for a lot of prayers. It's hard to think of being joyful with all of this that's going on. I admit that. But we must pay attention. And we need to speak out. Okay? Lord willing, we'll be back together on Sunday. Kathleen will be with me Sunday evening. We'll do our next live stream. In the meantime, I hope you're enjoying the pages of the January issue of Entangled magazine. And if you would do us the favor and spread the word far and wide. Okay? God bless you. Good night.